get started. Right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight, we have our Art of Podcasting workshop, which is taught by myself. I am Susan Winkler, the technology librarian, and Madeleine Wolske, who is our business librarian. And we're very happy to have you with us tonight. We hope that this will be a very fun and informative discussion about podcasting. Some of the things to keep in mind. We've got Madeleine's going to cover some of the theoretical things and sort of the planning aspects of it, and then I'll cover a demo of one of the apps that I think is pretty easy to use for creating your own podcast. But before we do that, we do want to take care of a couple of housekeeping things. If this is their first time in Zoom, or it's been a while since you've been in Zoom, I just want to mention that down at the bottom of your screen, we are going to be utilizing the chat function tonight. So if you have any questions, please put them in chat, and then we will relay them to each other. If you want to speak a question out loud, because I know sometimes typing it all out can be kind of cumbersome, you can also use the raised hand button. And if you use the raised hand button, we'll unmute you so that you can ask your question out loud. We do want you to ask questions throughout. Don't feel like you're interrupting us. This is the time for you to ask away as we go through things, and we'll work on finding times to kind of interject with those questions that you've got for us. I do also want to mention that we are recording tonight. We do not see you. The only video screens that are going on are mine and Madeleine's. So we don't see you on screen, so you don't have to worry about having a video on. What we do with that recording is we then put it up on our YouTube channel after probably a week or so, depending on what happens. And you're all welcome to watch the video again once we've got it up on YouTube. And we will send a follow-up email to everyone with the link to that video, and then also the link to the presentation from tonight, and also some additional resources that we've got for you. So I'm also going to put those in the chat in just a few minutes, but I do want to let you know that we will give you copies of the presentation and the additional resources that we're going to talk about tonight. So, okay. Did I miss anything?
I think that was perfect.
I don't think I missed anything. At least everything that I wrote down, I think I got to. Oh, live transcriptions. Yes. So if you would like to see what we're saying along the bottom of your screen, there is a little live transcription button. It's a little block that says CC. If you turn that on, you say show subtitle, you'll be able to see what we're saying as we're saying it. And if you see that and you don't want to see it, you can hit that button and say hide subtitle. Okay, now I'm done. I think that was the last one. So I'm going to go ahead and mention just a few things. The library is open, master recommended, but not required. We do also have our slide here where you can meet with us one-on-one with our Book a Librarian service. That's one-on-one with a staff member expert on topics of your choice, usually technology or business, which tonight's workshop is a collaboration between technology and business. But of course, we also have other things that we do, any sort of questions you might have. We have career questions, resume help. We have Crafty Adults programs, all of those things. And you can always reach out to us via live chat or also through email to get your questions answered.
Great. Well, Susan, thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and get started.
All right, let's jump right in.
Yes, thank you so much. All right. So first off, I have a quick poll. I'm just really curious to see where everyone's at within the podcasting sphere. So while you all click on what kind of best describes your familiarity with podcasting and where you're at in regards to producing your own, maybe, what's podcasting? Why is it different from maybe just listening on the radio? And the biggest aspect is selection and control. There is a podcast for everyone, and podcasting is absolutely for everyone. And it's also really interesting. So The Daily, this is a podcast from the New York Times. They actually reported to have about 4 million listeners a day. And that's greater than the number of primetime viewers for the most watched TV news network. So obviously it's a medium that a lot of people are utilizing to share their ideas, share their passion, and create community. So about this creating community, podcasting is niche casting, meaning you're creating this feeling of intimacy as a podcaster between yourself and your audience. So as a listener, the podcast is really speaking to you because they actively chose to listen to this podcast utilizing maybe Spotify or Google Play. A lot of other apps to choose whatever they'd like to listen to. So it's overall the combination of choice and comfort when you choose a podcast, which really transforms the art of listening from passive and idle, kind of just like turning on the radio, to active and engaged. So podcasting is amazing because, again, we're focusing on the aspect of choosing. So I'm looking at the poll now, and it looks like most people say they listen to some and they're curious about producing one. So this is a really great zone for everyone to be in for our webinar this evening.
Absolutely.
All right, so here's just an overview of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So we're starting with conception, going into format, kind of figuring out the nitty-gritty of how our podcast is going to get together, thinking about scheduling, how much time do you have available to commit to this, going into production, actively recording one, and Susan's going to be taking it away with that one. And then lastly, we're going to talk about launching your podcast and what are some best ways to do this. So, we went backwards. Let's go forwards. All right, so creating a concept. And again, it's poll heavy tonight just because I'm curious. But this is when we ask ourselves, what do we want to do? Are we sharing an idea? What kind of idea are we sharing? What do we want to accomplish with our podcast? What makes our podcast different than what else is being provided out there right now? How passionate are we about the story or concept that we want to share? So it's really easy to get excited about an idea that we coast on through using our own enthusiasm, but it's really easy to forget that our project lives and dies based off of the users and listeners' interest. So you might love your podcast idea, but why would another person like it? And so we're going to kind of answer that question, and also seeing who's kind of going through the poll. Create community through conversation. I love that because that's essentially marketing. And as a business librarian, that makes me pretty excited. All right, so before we get started, we need to really spend time thinking about who we're making this podcast for. We're essentially validating our podcast idea, but also giving ourselves some insight on how to format our podcast so they're more likely to listen to it. So first step is finding your target audience. So we want to make sure when we find our audience, we're being as specific as possible. And this is even applicable if you're not really sure what kind of subject or what podcast you want to make. By finding your audience, that'll give you the clues and context to create that podcast, to find that subject from it. So when we find our audience, we want to be as specific as possible. Well, you know what? I kind of just want to make a podcast for people who just like good narrative storytelling. That's way too general. I think the worst thing you can say is like, well, I want everybody to like it. Because if you're trying to make something appeal to everyone, more than likely the person who's not going to enjoy that is going to maybe comment negatively on your podcast, and we don't want that to happen. So how can we narrow down narrative storytelling to something that's a little bit more close to the bullseye? So maybe think of the demographic of the person who's going to be listening, and that's maybe saying like, well, I want to target millennials who love narrative storytelling, and maybe they have at least like 15 minutes of commute to work, and maybe there are also some people who feel kind of hopeless about American politics. That's closer, but maybe not even close enough. You can really get creative when you're thinking about your audience and kind of identifying who exactly are they. And cool thing, the library provides some really cool resources to help you identify your audience using some great secondary sources. So that's kind of like that demographics I talked about earlier. Maybe we can see who lives where if you're wanting to do a local podcast. Lots of different possibilities. So one example that I'm going to talk about, HubSpot, which you might be familiar with it. It's a software company that makes marketing tools for businesses. They knew that they wanted to create a podcast that's kind of identifying within like the business industry, but they really wanted to get kind of people excited about their products. So before they figured out the show concept, they essentially just did a bunch of research. They evaluated the 20 highest performing business podcasts, and they gained 5 distinct insights. For example, 87% of the hosts were men. 18 out of 20 podcasts provided commentary on industry news. Very few shows used audience engagement, and the tone of the shows was really businessy, academic. It was really jargony. So that audit of the highest performing business podcasts gave them the context to define their strategy and choose what they wanted to talk about. So in order to kind of have their show stand out from all the others, they're like, we're going to have diverse voices. We are going to make our stories really editorial. And we're also not going to use business jargon. We want the common man to be really interested in what we're performing. So through doing that secondary, that kind of research dive, they were able to pinpoint their target audience, but also establish their concept for the podcast. So, and after you found your target audience, kind of going on that note, we want to make sure you're specializing your topic. And so when HubSpot was saying, well, we want to go into the business industry, that's really broad. And so they were able to narrow it down and ask yourself questions like, what specifically about the business topic am I going to cover? What hasn't already been said on this topic? And by asking that, you're really ensuring how you can add to the podcasting space. There are millions of podcasts out there, growing by the day because it's such a valuable listen to medium. So figuring out what makes yours unique. How does it fit in what's already being there? Has someone already done it before? And you do it in a different way. Kind of figuring out just what's there, but what am I providing that's unique, different, and fantastically me? All right, so next, so after we've kind of gotten a general idea of our concept, I think a better way of understanding what your story is all about is by creating kind of an elevator pitch of sorts or a focus sentence. And this is from Out on the Wire, Story Secrets from the New Masters of Radio. It's a great book, recommend it. And these are 3 different ways a lot of podcast hosts and radio hosts kind of get the audience's attention in a way that's exciting, but also kind of summarizes exactly what the podcast is going to be about. So here's an example for what's the conflict. So Jim buys Janet a dog because he wants to impress her, but she hates dogs. I, for one, am intrigued. And the next one is maybe what's in a story. So I'm doing a story about the Westminster Dog Show. And what's interesting about it is the winner is blind. Kind of see how you're kind of throwing out that reel, getting people interested in something surprising. The last one is why should I care? So it's telling a story. Like I went to Starbucks and I got a cup of coffee. I'm waiting in line forever. And then I got a tap on my back and you wouldn't believe it, but it's Nicolas Cage. And the reason why that's crazy and interesting to every single person on the planet is because everybody wants to know what type of coffee he ordered. So those are some examples that kind of can help you figure out what the focus of your podcast is. Plus, it's just a fun exercise to do. All right, next we're finding our format. So since we've conceptualized our podcast, narrowed down our field, defined our audience, it's time to start shaping it. So we are creating our podcast sandwich. So by figuring out mainly what styles we want to do. And I want to emphasize, I think some of my favorite podcasts are a mixture of a lot of these different styles. So interview, it's pretty self-explanatory. Maybe the show brings on an expert guest for a Q&A, roundtable panel, maybe like a chat cast. It's maybe hosted by more than one person where there's commentary, criticism, variety of topics. Could be a performance program that might be very dramatic where there's theater to it. That's kind of not off the cuff. It could also be a narrative where someone's telling a story about themselves. It could also be a debate or, again, a hybrid. It can be more than one of these things. And when you're choosing your style or styles, I think it's really important to consider the energy of the podcast and how it relates to the concept itself. So a chat might have a kind of high energy that's maybe for like you're trying to get a younger crowd. You want more than one person to be talking because you know that the person person who's going to be listening to it may have a shorter attention span versus the energy of the expertise of an interview. I always think of like the actor's studio, that formal Q&A aspect. So when you're choosing your style, consider the energy, your brand itself, how you want your podcast to feel, your audience, always consider your audience, and then incorporate that into your focus sentences that we had created earlier. So like, how is the hook going to reflect the style of my podcast? And then also, I think it's so great to kind of identify, what do you personally look for in podcasts, and which ones do you currently enjoy? Take some notes, reevaluate some of the ones that you kept going back to, that you subscribed immediately. What was it about that podcast that really got your attention and kind of maintained your interest? So here is a content example. And I really love this because, yes, we see these different components, but above them, they broke down the tone of what the content's going to be, and then included the style of how to do it. So we have like their podcast is from podcastmovement.com. They're inspiring individuals. They then do a little entertainment and then an education. And you can see they use a couple of different styles to kind of establish their podcast. So obviously we see some interviews. Right now it's just mainly interviews, but that could be maybe a roundtable interview. It could be, again, many different things. But as someone who learns visually, I think even if you wanted to print this out, or again, we're happy to print this out for you if you want to pick it up at the library. You can kind of just start maybe crossing things off, seeing what components you want in your podcast sandwich. All right. So sticking to a schedule. To ensure success, we've got to plan, which is not what a lot of people want to hear, myself being one of them. But the best way of evaluating and validating your time is to use a helpful little equation we call the value equation. So this essentially is establishing an understanding of how much time you're putting into it, how much your time is worth, and also how much passion you're bringing to the table. So don't underestimate production time. Good podcasts are hard to make, and they'll take a lot of time and dedication. But don't let that kind of overwhelm you, because it's always easy to break down these larger, intimidating tasks into smaller, achievable, just checkpoints. So first off, learning curves. Consider if you want to outsource someone. If you're producing this all yourself and you're like, you know what, I'm getting into podcasts because I want to learn how to video edit or audio edit, and I want to learn how to maybe create my own brand and get to know social media a little bit more. You can be a DIY operation. By the way, the library has a lot of resources to help you with that. But maybe you're like, you know what, I really just want to talk into a microphone and that's it. Consider just reaching out to your network and seeing, well, maybe, oh, I know Susan. She just took a course on Adobe Premiere. Maybe she would be interested in producing my podcast for me if I paid her in brownies. That's a possibility.
I do love brownies.
And then next is time banks. I want to emphasize, take your intended schedule that you have, increase it, because again, we want to create that time for error. We want to be flexible also to avoid burnout. So this is something I see with a lot of burgeoning entrepreneurs. You have a wonderful idea, the passion is there, you've got a lot of just gumption to do that DIY solopreneur lifestyle and hustle, 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 hustle. The burnout's inevitable. Think about what you're doing right now and when you have the time to work on your podcast. And lastly, maybe consider changing your format if it's like too much. Not all podcasts need to be 60 minutes long. I mean, one of my favorites, a short, like 6-minute interval. And I really appreciate just that quick snippet of information right in the morning. Maybe getting a co-host, you're splitting up the responsibilities with someone else, or again, you can outsource that, or even narrow your podcast scope. If you're kind of overwhelmed by all the research that it's taking to put this together, maybe reevaluate.
So. Sure, co-hosts also like brownies.
Yes. And also I love podcasts where it's basically like just people hanging out and having fun. So that's another possibility. It doesn't have to be all on your shoulders. So next, think like a company. And this is going to help you kind of understand what tasks you need to break down. So this is essentially tasks that NPR put together. These are NPR structure roles and what each person specifically does. So this is where you can gauge your confidence with each role by reading the description, make note of where you need to step back and outsource or where you want to learn. And lastly, this is just kind of a list of examples to give you inspiration or even like a checklist of what you can do in order to conceptualize and produce your podcast. So it has you starting with this pre-production. And again, we're going to be sending you this so you can just print this out and just check mark each as soon as you're done. When you're producing, Susan's going to go into this a little bit more. And then post-production and publication. It's kind of when you launch your podcast. Well, what happens now? But also, these are just suggestions. Don't be overwhelmed by all of these things. If you want to just create a podcast that's almost like, you know what, my great-grandmother recorded some of her own histories, and I just really want to create something for my friends and family, you've eliminated inserting ads at least. So just make sure that you understand that this is editable and it's customizable to exactly how you'd like it. So lastly, a ready, set, go on creating your podcast. This is Project Blueprint. And I'm going to click this and oh my goodness, it opened up. Great. So this was produced by NPR, and this is essentially a wonderful workbook to kind of help you think through what you want to provide a podcast. So it has that focus sentence, has defining your audience, and it just has great ideas to just narrow down exactly what you want to make. But this, again, we're happy to print it out and make it work for you. All right. Well, that's kind of it as far as starting a concept. Susan, would you like to take the reins?
Absolutely. So like Madeleine was saying, for many podcasts, there is a whole team that works on the different aspects of it. But one of the things that we're trying to do tonight is get you a chance to step into the world of podcasting without having to have a full team at the ready at the get-go, to just sort of explore if you're interested in starting something. And one of the ways that you can begin to explore podcasting and get that creative energy out there without having to know a whole lot of behind the scenes technical production aspects is to use an app that already exists. And in our case today, we're going to use Anchor, which is an offshoot from Spotify. But the reason we're going to use Anchor is because, one, it's free. Two, it's very easy to get started. And when you're just starting out, and it sounds like for a lot of us, we are in that boat of beginning to think about our podcast and what we might want to do. It can be used on either a smartphone or a tablet, or it can be used on the computer. So it's nice that you don't have to have separate equipments. You don't have to have an elaborate sound studio to work in. You don't have to you can start by recording in your closet, which I know many professional podcasters actually were doing during the pandemic. When they couldn't get into their studios, they were doing things from their closet as well. So it's a nice way to get started without having to have a lot of the technical knowledge that you would have had to have, that's a long sentence, would have had to have a few years back. So it's also got the ability to, once you have it packaged and it's ready to go and you hit publish, Anchor will actually distribute it to some of the major podcast catchers, like Apple and Google and some of the other major ones, where you don't have to do the extra work of getting it out there in that aspect. So, which is another reason that we thought Anchor might be a good place to start. It also has a lot of favorable online reviews, even among professional podcasters. I've read several reviews from professional podcasters that said, if you're just starting out, this is a good tool to use at the beginning. So it's not the only tool by any means, though. There are several other tools out there. There are several other things that you could use to make something. And if you really decide that you get really involved in developing podcasts and stuff, like Madeleine said earlier, we do have resources that we can point you to help you learn the other tools and things that are out there to help make podcasts better. So, okay. All righty. So according to Anchor, there are essentially 5 steps to creating a podcast. The first step is to make your first episode. Then you're going to set up your podcast, which basically means you're going to go ahead and name it. You're going to get your graphics together of what things look like. And Madeleine's going to mention and talk about graphics a little bit later when she talks a little bit more about marketing and branding. Then you're going to distribute that podcast. Step 4 is optional, and that is to monetize the podcast. And one of the things Anchor does do is match you with sponsors. After you get a certain number of listeners, they will match you to sponsors if you opt into that to help you monetize your podcast. And then for them, step 5 is to get listeners. And Madeleine is also going to cover some very good examples and tools to help you get those listeners to help build your audience. Okay, you can go ahead and move on. Next one. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to a live demo now of Anchor and how Anchor, and we're going to go ahead and essentially create a small snippet of a podcast episode, going over the kinds of things that we've already talked about, that Madeleine has already talked to us about, and we'll define what we're looking for, what our podcast is going to do, and then I can show you the major steps that you would go through. So I'm going to go ahead and take over and share my screen. And then I am going to switch my video. And then Madeleine, if you'll go ahead and spotlight my video here in a second so that everyone can see mine. I think you might have to stop your share. There we go. Okay. And then if you can, perfect, thank you. All right, so this is actually the library's iPad that we have where we're going to go ahead and demo Anchor for everyone today. I'm going to go ahead and give it a little bit better focus here. Let me take it up just a little bit. Make it a little more. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into Anchor, and I've already signed up for an account. But when you first get in, the first thing you should see, I'll go ahead and make this that for us so we can see it a little bit better. Hopefully you can all see that a little better. I'm hoping. Can you see that? Can everyone see that?
It's a little light, but
okay,
legible.
I can see if I can make it a little darker here. Make it darker. I think that's also because I have the ring light here. So let me turn that away. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, we'll turn the ring light a little bit further away. Okay. I know the pink is a little hard to see. It's a little hard to expose with a document camera for all the different potential colors that are in here. But as you can see, when you first get started, it's got a very nice layout here where your step 1 is basically to, format your podcast. Basically, you're going to go ahead and you can use all of the tools on the left-hand side to create your podcast, and then you're going to build it, and then you're going to publish it. Okay, so in our scenario here today, let's say that we've spent some time, we know what kind of podcast we want to create. We want to recreate a podcast for the library, and we want to interview staff here at the library about their favorite books for certain topics. So, and that's what we're going to do for our podcast. So the first thing you might consider is if you saw where Madeleine had showed that visual, the graphic of the from Movement, I believe it was Podcast Movement, where it has a teaser and then a little bit of an intro, and then then there's the interview, then there's the like an ad, and then there's some more stuff. We're going to kind of base ours on that. We're going to focus, since we only have so much time this evening, we're going to focus a little bit more on that teaser and intro bit. So I'm going to go ahead and say we're going to record, and we're going to record our introduction for our podcast. So once we're here and we tap on this microphone, let me see if I can make that a little bit darker. Once we tap on this microphone down here, that's going to record whatever I say. And so I can basically record the beginning of our podcast or our teaser or whatever section of the podcast I'm creating. So I'm going to go ahead and say record. Welcome to the Book Nook, the library's podcast for all things related to books. Or, something like that. Okay. Then I get the chance to add some background music. So background music, let's go ahead and we'll add background music. We get all sorts of different choices for background music here. And if you want to preview it, you can just hit the little play button. And I don't know if everybody can hear that or not. Hoping you could hear that. I might need to turn it up a little bit.
I think it might need to be turned up just a bit.
Okay, let me turn up the volume on the iPad here. Okay, and I'll try to put my a little bit closer. So anyway, you can preview them. Okay, hoping you could hear that.
Yes.
Okay, so let's say I'm going to pick Morning Color Wheel as my background music for my little intro. All I have to do is hit that plus sign, and that will add Morning Color Wheel to my intro section here. Now, if I want to preview my audio of my voice with the background music, Anchor is smart enough to know that the background music should not overpower your vocals, so it'll be a little bit small, a little bit softer. So we'll go ahead and hit play. Record. Welcome to the Book Nook, the library's podcast for all things related to books. Okay, so hopefully you heard that, at least the beginning of it. So that's our little intro. And then all I have to do, if I'm happy with it, I just tap save down here at the bottom, and then I'm going to give it a title. And then it's going to be what's known as a segment. So we're going to call it intro. And I'm going to say add recording to episode. So what that's going to do is it's actually going to add it right here as the first segment in our podcast. So it's going to process it. Let me turn the auto. Let me get the autofocus here. A little bit better. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit so you guys can see it a little better, and turn this down a little bit more. Okay, I think we're getting a little bit of light off that too. Okay, can everybody still see that? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so while that's playing, and it's got a little, if you can see, it's got a little music note up here to denote that it has background music to it. And now there are things I can do with this segment once I've got it here as well. I'm going to zoom out I'm going to zoom in. Sorry, I'm zooming in a little bit so you can see it a little better. There we go. Okay, so once you've got it set up here, I'm going to go ahead and darken that a little bit more. So once I've got my intro here, the three little dots over here, I'm hoping those look okay. We need to make it a little bit, yep, sorry, a little darker here. So the three little dots here are going to let you do other things with this particular segment. So I can edit my background music, I can rename it, I can delete it entirely, or I can trim the start and end points. So if you heard where it actually picked up that I said the word record, if I wanted to take that out, I could do trimming of the start and end points. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me the whole sound file here. And when I play it, I can pause it when I hear the part that I don't want there. And so I can move my start over a little bit further. And hit. To the Book Nook. So there you go. And then I can move it just a little bit more. So it picks up. To the Book Nook, the library's podcast. So if I wanted to use this portion instead of where it says, you know, welcome, I can actually save and trim. And then that's going to edit that sound for me. And then I can also edit my audio if I want, in case I coughed or something else happened in there. So that is just the general for getting started with recording. Now, as Madeleine mentioned, sometimes you want to do things where you want it to be, say, a panel of people that you're interviewing or doing something with. You can also use Anchor to invite your friends or other people to other panelists to record with you. And you just share a link with everyone, and then everyone will be able to join in as you're recording, and you can have a whole conversation with other people and then pop it into your podcast. So it's very easy to use Anchor to create a panel or an interview, discussion, all of that kind of stuff. Okay. The library, which is where you get your little folder here, allows you to take files that you've already recorded and add them. So the last time we ran this class was in August. So you can see a lot of these things are going to be in July, late July, early August from the first time we ran it. But I also have a recording from Madeleine that she sent me last time that we used as her discussion of her recommended podcasting books. So if I wanted to take that from here, all I have to do is hit the plus sign, and that's immediately going to add it into my podcast. So you can think of the podcast building as essentially building each different segment with the individual pieces of your podcast that you're going to put together for each time. Now, remember we talked about having a teaser. So a teaser would probably be something where you're going to say, you know, today we're going to have Madeleine and she's going to talk to us about her podcast books. And you might even put that before your intro as the teaser, and then you'd have maybe an ad. So that all depends on how you want your podcast to be structured. But you can move things around and rearrange things once you've got them in here too. So if I decided I wanted to add, let's just pick something that we would call our teaser. Oh, interesting. The intro, let's see, 4 minutes ago intro, and then we had a 2 minutes when I cut it. Let's go and pick our intro from last time we did it, and we'll pop it in there. So now I have two different intros. And again, if this is an intro and that's an intro, hard to understand which one's which. I can rename this by tapping on it. Oops, let me wait a second on that. I'm going to hit here and I'm going to rename my segment. And instead of calling it intro, I'm going to call this intro from August, just as our example that we're using today. And then if I wanted this to be first, I can just hold it down and drag it to rearrange them and then hit save. Okay, so it's very easy to rearrange elements once you've got them in here. Now, because it is linked to Spotify, this fourth one down is actually in case you want to use full length licensed music, which is connected to a Spotify premium account. So if you have a premium account, you can browse through your playlists because all of the music has been licensed through Spotify so that you can use it in your podcasts as well. You're not allowed to edit any of that music, of course, because it is performed by another artist and it is under their licensing agreement. So to keep that in mind, that if you're going to play a song, it's going to be a whole song. Okay. Okay. We can also, if you're running a show where you have a call-in show where maybe you allow people to leave you messages about the previous week's show, and sometimes they might leave you a voicemail message. And if you want to, you can share that message in your next podcast. There's one that I listen to regularly where they do it. It's basically a call-in show. And it's all just, they have an expert that comes on the show, talks about stuff, and then basically everybody else asks questions, and then they follow up and ask questions the next week too. And the same person then comes back and answers them. That might be something where you would use the voicemail messages as a possibility. The ones that I find the most fun, though, within building your podcast are the interludes, which are essentially your transitional music or transitional sounds in between your different segments. So, for example, here, these are all little transitional sounds that you can put in between your different segments. So moving from our intro to Madeleine's recommendation, maybe we would put kind of a fun, funky little, I don't know if you can you hear that okay?
Kind of.
Okay, let me put the speaker a little closer. So depending on the tone of your podcast, you may, if you listen to any of the, say, the true crime podcasts that are out there, you definitely get a sense that it's a true crime podcast based on the interludes that they put in between. So if I wanted this one, I'd go ahead and hit that and add it, and then I could put it in between our intro and Madeleine's recommendation and save that. And then there are also some fun sounds. So if you're running a show where maybe it's a game show, like if you're familiar with Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, which is an NPR quiz show, they ask their panelists about the news in the last week, and then they guess the right answer for some quiz questions. You might also use something that goes along with quizzing, like the trumpet sound. If someone gets an answer incorrect. So you could also place that in there. There's all sorts of fun sound effects in here. Now you may also notice up here at the top that there's a button that says import. Import allows you to import your own things that you have created using other apps. So if, for example, you've created something really cool in GarageBand or some other musical app, you can import that into your library, into here using import. and then add it directly into your podcast. So you're not limited to just Anchor's already existing library of sounds and interludes. You can also add your own, which is pretty nice. Okay. Are there any questions so far?
We do have one question.
Sure.
So we have if you are doing a panel, do all the people need to be in the same place at the same time, or can it be done remotely, like a Zoom-like podcast?
And I think what I would say is it's kind of up to you to see which works best for the vibe and the format of your show. At least in the Anchor environment, you can do it where they don't all have to be in the same place, but as long as they're all on essentially the same phone call or the same Zoom call, or getting in through the same link, then they're all in there together. And I think that does help. It kind of helps to have it where if it's going to be more of a conversation, where a question is posed to everyone on the panel, then everyone gets an opportunity to respond and kind of can feed off of each other's answers. In that respect, it's kind of nice to have them all at least there in real time, either virtually or in person. And if virtually, that's okay too. If you have pre-planned questions where you're going to ask everyone the same question and then have them respond, you can also record it that way, and then kind of intermix them with each other too. I don't know, Madeleine, what do you think?
I think that's perfect. Okay. I think as long as you have that one specific audio file that you can then upload and manipulate around.
Yes,
that's all that matters.
That's a good point too, because yes, you might end up, somebody's answer may be super, super long to a certain question where you end up having to trim it down a little bit for time, and also then make sure that you get everyone else's answers as well. Or if you're, you as the podcast editor, for example, you're the one who gets to make that determination of what is the most important piece of everyone's answer that they gave you, and how it speaks to what you're doing with the podcast. And with Anchor especially, you're basically just giving them the link to anyone that you want, and they can join in as long as you're still recording. So that gives you that live element. As long as they have something like a smartphone or a tablet, and as long as they're recording somewhere without a whole lot of ambient noise that will get in the way, they can use the microphone on their smartphone or their tablet. You might ask them to go into a room with a closed door at least, so you don't hear kids or pets in the background. But again, that's up to you. And, you may also want that ambient noise. If it's something where, say, your podcast is about nature and being out among the birds and, the flowers, and you can hear the wind blowing and things like that, that's somewhere where you do want some of that ambient noise to come through, because it is integral to the sort of the vibe that you're presenting.
Yes. So you essentially asked, the next question was, do you need an external microphone? Pretty well. Okay. And then the last one we have is, does Anchor allow you to add photos that change like a slideshow throughout the podcast?
So in this case, most of what we're doing here is audio on this podcast. They also, you can do a video component. And I know there are several where you can upload to Apple. And I know this from having done art history stuff in the past, where you really need to be able to see the image and then have people talk about it, where you can do a video podcast. It's essentially, you have your video screen. I don't believe that Anchor has that capability currently. You do have the ability to put a cover image to each episode and do an image for your overall podcast, for the branding and the marketing. That's a great question, though. We can follow up on that in the follow-up email to be sure. I have not seen anything where they've mentioned having a slideshow component to the basic features of Anchor, though. But there are probably other podcasting apps out there that do allow that. Have you come across that, Madeleine?
I have not.
Ask you. Okay. So I think at least for most of them, they're more focused on the audio components.
Agreed.
Okay. If we're good with that, I'm going to go ahead and move on just to the next section, if that's cool, unless there's other questions.
There's one more. Can I do the interview asynchronously, which I'm wondering if maybe that means with more than one app open at a time?
Yeah, or I mean, if you want to interview, if you're interviewing one person, and you cover part of it, you maybe you have 5-10 minutes one day, and you ask them a couple of questions and cover it in the 5-10 minutes. Then you come back another day and ask them more questions. You can absolutely do that, and you can, when you import it into your library, you can pull the pieces that you want, and just pull them in each as a different segment. So if you're looking to, say you had enough time to interview them on a Monday, you pull that in here, and then you can cut it up too, because that's the idea of, so if maybe part of your teaser at the beginning is going to be a quote from them, and you're pulling it from, one of those interview questions, so you can isolate that quote under the editing features that you have. So if I was coming here again, and say, I'm going to edit this intro, and you would just edit the audio, and then you can pick out, maybe you want to pick out that quote and separate out that quote and save it as a separate file that then can become your teaser. So you can do it where it's really up to you if you, if you want to do it in pieces, the original interview in pieces, or, what you pull out from that interview into pieces. And I think that's a lot of what ends up happening with editing for podcasts, because a lot of times you're going to run out of time basically for your podcast. So you'll end up trimming down the interviews that you do with people, especially if it's a 6-minute podcast like Madeleine's that she likes in the morning. Because 6 minutes goes by a lot faster than you think, especially when you're trying to throw content in there. So, okay. So once you've gotten your, let's say this is our episode here. To preview it, we can preview it.
The All Things Library Podcast, where staff from the Champaign Public Library discuss all things related to libraries. I'm Susan Winkler, today's host, and with me we have Madeleine Wolske, our business librarian, who will be reviewing books on podcasting. All right, welcome to the Book Nook.
Clearly my
podcast for all things related to books.
Can you still hear that? I'm hoping.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Madeleine Wolske. I'm the business librarian.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and pause that. So anyway, you can preview all the pieces of it. If you want to change anything, move things around, do any editing, you can do all of that right from this screen here. Once you're ready to publish, you just tap publish. And then here is where you're going to give your podcast episode a title. So keep in mind you have a podcast title, and you also have titles for each episode. Now your episode title could be as simple as, episode 1, episode 2, episode 3, but that doesn't really give a whole lot of, and Madeleine will talk about this later, naming conventions are going to be really important for helping people discover your podcast. So even if my episode title was, discussion with Madeleine Wolske about podcasting, that already gives me a couple of key terms. It talks about business, podcasting, and the person I'm interviewing. Okay. Now in your description, you can go into a little bit more detail. You might mention a couple of other things that are happening in the podcast, but keep in mind, if you've heard of SEO, the search engine optimization, that is going to play into this. How are people going to find you? How are people going to find your podcast? And Anchor also does let you give keywords to your podcast once you've set up your first episode and published it. So even if I say, let's say Champaign, let's do Champaign Public Library discussion with, takes me a long time to type like this, MW, okay, or whatever. And then down here you put podcasting resources. So obviously I'm just doing this real quick, and you'd spend more time on it than I am. Then you can customize your cover art, which Madeleine will talk about this too, and about branding and things like that. Make sure you spell things correctly too, which I'm not even sure if I spelled that correctly because I did it so fast. And then down below, it'd be season 1, episode 1. So season 1, episode 1 of the podcast. And that way it's a better way to organize and things. And then you can just go ahead and say publish. And when you publish, that means it's out there and then other people will see it. So now if you see up at the top here where Anchor is saying the optional section would be setting up monetization, which Madeleine's going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And after you reach a certain point in your audience numbers, you can set up monetization for your podcast. The other thing I want to show you before we jump back to that stuff is down here in the bottom corner, this section on the profile off to the left. So if I show you the profile here, this is where you can get to your statistics for your app. Let me go ahead and make that a little bit brighter here. Can we see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. 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 So you have your episodes. So again, when we're talking about pre-production and planning, if you're, let's say you have a specific launch date where you want to launch in April, maybe you've got a couple of podcasts already set, ready to go with discussion and everything else, so that your production time is going to be, say it takes you about a week to get everything together. Well, if you start in April with your first episode, you're going to want to make sure if you're launching it where it's monthly, you've got enough time to get that second episode out and third and fourth. So you're already building those next episodes, even though those first couple are ready to go and kind of finished and can just launch when you're ready to launch them, and you can schedule them. Okay, so if we look at what we've got here too, the activity is going to be activity about, and we won't have any now because we just published it, but that'll be activity that you'll get when you get listeners and feedback through Anchor and through Spotify, because once you've published it, Anchor is also publishing it to their platform too, where people can discover it. Your account settings is just the information, a custom URL for your podcast, your email address, all that information. And then the podcast setting lets you fix your art if you want something different. And then giving your name. And then again, like we talked about, your podcast description, where you're going to have the categories, and Anchor is going to help you identify the categories, and then they'll put that stuff in there. And then the availability of where it's going to go, where it's going to get distributed, and then your analytics. And this is going to be the most important thing for a lot of us once we've launched them, is to figure out your analytics of, who's listening, and where. I think it also does where they're coming from too, and what type of device they're listening on. So, and then down here would be your monetization with the money. And that's going to be once you get a certain number of listeners. Okay. So I just wanted to share that information there. And we'll go back to our episode. And then once you're in here, you can see your segments and your episode. Okay. All right. That's all I have. I'm going to go ahead and unpublish this one just so it's not floating around out there for now, since it's on our demo account here.
For sure. Okay, so I'm going to quickly take over again, and we're going to talk about what happens. You've already launched it, or you've already created it, you've produced it. So now let's launch it. So don't expect listeners to find you. If you build it, people won't come. We have to find them. So asking yourself, how are we going to get the word out? First thing first is establishing a home base. This can be a website. This can be a social media profile. You just need to have somewhere where you can interact with your listeners, with your potential listeners, and a place where people can get some more information about what you're putting out there. So this is essentially answering the question, how can listeners connect with you? Next, we have collaborate. So people are more likely to consider a podcast if it's recommended to them. And a great way of getting on other people's recommendation lists is by borrowing an audience. So when you can do this by collaborating with other podcast hosts, you can reach out to existing podcasts, maybe refer back to that list you made of podcasts within your industry or niche that you're really enjoying. Reach out to them and see if they might want to feature you as an expert. And maybe when you're on that podcast, you can then maybe say, oh yeah, and if you're interested about the biodiversity of ocean life, refer to my own personal podcast as a way of kind of getting people excited about what you're doing. So when you are reaching out to other podcasts or networks, it's great to have a media and a press kit. So this would include a short bio about yourself, a headshot, which by the way, in April, we're having a free headshot opportunity at the library. It might include links to your podcast, any site links, logo, graphics that the podcast might use to advertise you, scheduling tips on how to book you, and essentially list of topics that you're the expert at. You want to make it as easy as possible for other people to interview you and feature you on their podcast. Next, you can find your community. You can join podcast communities, and I would recommend just doing a hard Google of podcast community. This might be Facebook groups. These are websites dedicated to podcast producers. Get comfortable with cold calling and maybe networking, just meeting other people who are doing things that you're doing, making great contacts. It's going to make your job easier as far as getting your work out there. Thank you. And one way you can do that is even by engaging with them, engaging with their podcasts. Say like, oh, hey, Susan, here's a screenshot of my 5-star review on your podcast, The Book Bites. I loved it. I thought it was great. And by the way, I'm also a librarian and I could be featured on your podcast. That's a great way of just kind of showing your interest, showing your enthusiasm, but also being like a, hey, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of thing. You can also engage with audience. This is something that I talk a lot about to people who are maybe wanting to get the word of their business out there via social media. If you create a social media account, it's not just, I think the hardest work is not posting regular content. It's using that account to engage and interact with people that you want to buy your product or service. So it's finding people who maybe regular comment about podcasts. I know we have a colleague who she's very active on Twitter and she's having so many conversations with people who produce podcasts, and she has a following of people who kind of follow her recommendations. So find these people who share ideas and just try to get on their radar, maybe by just throwing a like or commenting like, wow, love that top. Just something silly. It could even change who pays attention to what you're doing. And lastly, encourage reviews. So reviews is really just kind of like organic growth you can get from listeners. So, and again, people decide if they want to listen to something because of a recommendation, because of a review. The more reviews you have that are positive, it'll also increase your ranking within the podcast lists. And Susan had also mentioned naming conventions and search engine optimization. So when people are trying to find podcasts within a specific industry or niche, they're going to put business, they're going to put oceanography. If you have those keywords, not only in your podcast descriptions, episode descriptions, but maybe within a blog post that you have on your home base, or hashtag oceanography within your social media account, that's going to get the word out a lot more than just, again, not doing anything. All right. So yes, that was a lot. Madeleine, how do I organize all of these things I want to do? Introducing the one-page marketing plan. This is a tool that I really enjoy using because it's so succinct. Essentially, this is a way of just mapping out your process of marketing. Again, breaking it down into achievable tasks. So focusing on your before, which really, we already kind of identified that when we were conceptualizing our podcast. We made our elevator pitch. We identified who we're going to talk to. Maybe this time you're like, okay, so if I'm doing a business podcast, business people are on LinkedIn over TikTok. That's not true, but maybe it is for your audience. So maybe I'm going to prioritize LinkedIn for my messaging versus something else. And then when you get to during, this is where you're trying to gain and deserve the attention of the people who may be interested in what you're putting out there. So you're answering questions like, how are you getting people interested in what you're doing? Maybe following up, like saying, hey, I saw you liked my page, or you kind of enjoyed this thing that I put out there. Thanks for doing that. I also found this thing that was relevant to you. Here you go. And then finishing on just the after. And I just want to say, this is definitely a breadth, not depth that we're going into tonight. If you want to meet with me one-on-one and we can really get into the nitty-gritty, I'm happy to do so.
Same.
Yeah, Susan's also same.
I can be on the technical side.
Of course, yeah, because we've definitely hit our hour, but we just get too excited about this stuff. I think it's so important to really focus on that after, because if people just subscribe, which is kind of what you want, but it might not be the end all be all. I think when you're putting content out there in the form of podcasting, you want to make sure that you maybe put other things that really increase your valuable nature to the person who's listening to you. Again, it's always important to not shout, but engage with your audience. A lot of people just say, oh, I'm using my social media account just to broadcast my podcast. It's like, well, people aren't going to want to engage with your social media account if it's just saying, hey, listen to my podcast here. Hey, do this over here. Instead, you want to be providing entertaining, engaging, valuable content that really gets them excited about what you're providing. Again, a lot of the goal is just to we're putting the fishing lure out there, slowly reeling them in. So what can you do to maintain interest? And Susan also mentioned when she was talking about consistently posting your episodes, that's something that's really key for listeners, making sure you have identified what your posting schedule is going to be like for your episodes. Are you a weekly person, monthly? Are you doing seasons? Make sure you convey that to your audience in a clear way, because unfortunately, one thing as librarians that we kind of notice is reading isn't a priority for a lot of people when you're trying to convey instructions. So as plainly as you can make it. And then lastly, just really think about yourself. Again, going back to your podcasts that you really enjoy. What do you like as a listener about those podcasts? Why did they draw you in? How did you hear about that podcast? And take that reflection and consideration when you are kind of putting out your own leads. Oh, that was not right. That's a link to a PDF that you can print out.
Oh, that reminds me to put the additional resources in the chat too. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now.
Thanks, Susan. So really quickly about branding and conveying your podcast visually. So this is essentially asking yourself, what is the main thing I want to say? And how can I convey that in a visual way? So thinking about the tone, the colors being used, even the font itself. Are you a fun podcast? Is this something serious? Is this a terrifying monster zodiac killer podcast? I loved when Susan was talking about the whole genres that are available within kind of those segue music that you can put in there. An eerie sound is not going to work with the Gold Digger podcast. This is kind of an entrepreneur podcast, really engaging. I enjoy it. She does a lot of upbeat stuff because her whole thing is you can do it, dig those goals, do the best thing in your life, all the things. And I will say, if you are going to be making your own podcast art, we do recommend one resource I enjoy using is Canva. And Susan does have a lot of videos on YouTube on how to utilize Canva. It's great too, because they already have templates that you can use and adapt to what you need. But also it has the sizing that you need, which is important. So, and
I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat for the YouTube channel too.
Thank you. All right. And again, lastly, define success for you. So what does success look like in terms that you can measure? Is it the amount of downloads? Is it the amount of users who follow you or subscribe to you? Is it the critical acclaim you've received? Is it the amount of advertisers who are monetizing your podcast? Ask yourself, what do you want out of this? What is your goal out of this? Susan had mentioned you can monetize your podcast with Anchor, and I believe you have that option once you get up to 50 listeners. And you can absolutely, once you do get bigger, you might be prepositioned. That's not the right word, but advertisers might reach out to you, especially if what you're talking about is in line with their specific brand. So this is where, again, you're going to utilize that media kit and maybe use it to pitch yourself to publishers or partners. You're essentially wooing people if you want some more financial gain from this. Last thing I do want to mention is don't treat the launch of your podcast as the end of your development, but just as the beginning. So when you put something out there, I mean, a lot of my favorite podcasts that I've been listening to for the longest time, it's kind of really awesome to hear how they've changed. Maybe the microphone they used is a lot clearer at the end. They use completely different introductory music. It's essentially always think back to your audience, because your audience is probably going to change, and see how you can be flexible creating that service and content out there and grow based off what you're hearing from feedback, maybe asking people how it is. And lastly, reframing failure. If you're not enjoying it, embrace it. That's totally fine. Trust your gut if something doesn't seem to be working, and always be flexible. Maybe think of, okay, this is where I go back to the value equation, and maybe do I need to reconsider my role in this, or the style of my podcast? There's nothing bad about going back to the drawing board. If anything, I support it, because again, we want to keep on polishing, researching, making sure we're producing something that is top dollar.
And right. Reinvent.
Yes. Well, we're a little over, but I am out of breath. So additional resources.
You want me to take this part?
No, it's perfectly fine. Thank you though, Susan.
This is the part of the teamwork, and having a co-host also means you don't have to talk the whole time by yourself too.
Absolutely. So one of my favorite resources that I really enjoyed was NPR's podcast Startup Guide by Glenn Weldon. It really was great as far as conceptualizing. And Susan.
Yeah. So Anchor, and this is why another reason why we picked Anchor. They have some startup tutorials and guides as well that are built right into the service on their website. So they have the should I start a podcast, i.e. do I have something unique to say, which is of course what Madeleine has been saying as a jumping off point for everyone tonight. And if you want to start a podcast, what is it? Any questions you might have, getting the word out, all this stuff. And they have a nice little tutorial that is actually a podcast on how to podcast. So that is one thing that I looked at when I was first deciding if Anchor would be a good one for everybody to sort of tip of the iceberg, get your feet wet kind of thing. So
yeah. And also
I do recommend it.
Susan, this is a good time to input in a question we had earlier. What are some of the other podcasting apps out there besides Anchor?
And I think I put this in the additional resources too, but one of the places I looked was there is a place called the Podcast Host, which has, usually they rank podcasting apps, and this is by professionals that are actually in the podcasting industry, and to basically simplify the process, because for so long it has been a involved, complicated process to get your podcasts out there and to get them up on the different services. There were some stringent things that you would have to do to get it published and distributed through Apple's podcast app, and same with Google and everything else. So some of the ones they recommended in the same article, and I can share this in the chat too, that I also took a look at. There's Podbean, and I can put these in the chat too, and also Spreaker, and then they have Anchor in there, and then something called Descript, which I did not check that one out. But there's also some other stuff. And of course, there's also things like Audacity, which is software that you can put on your computer, and then you could use, that's for sound editing. So there's lots of other ways you can do it too, where you can take different bits and pieces and components from different places and then create it that way too. But those are just a couple, and I can put that in the follow-up email too. That was one place where I looked. I also looked at Make Use Of, which is one of the tech sites that I follow. They do a nice job of putting things into terms that pretty much anyone can understand, even though it's written for a general audience with technology terms and things kind of thrown in there. And they said, Audacity, you can even do it with GarageBand, or there may even be some default apps that are already on your devices. The default your microphone that already exists on your smartphone or tablet generally are pretty good for getting started. And that way you don't have to invest massive amounts of money in the newest, greatest, like stand-up mic or speakers or sound systems until you know for sure that you really want to do it and you get really into podcasting. I always like to say, if you're starting out and you're more on the hobbyist side or the just starting to get involved to help promote your business or other sides of things, that you want to make sure that the amount of money you spend on the tech also kind of balances out with your time and your effort and everything else. And in the beginning, if it's not something, like Madeleine said, if it's something that you try it and then it's not for you, or you need to reinvent it, then you haven't put a whole lot of money into it until you know for sure that it's something you want to commit to. So,
yeah, thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Yep.
So I'm going to take this opportunity to let everyone know, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, or we've had a couple of people utilizing the Q&A portion. But while you're asking questions, we can quickly go over some of the other things. We decided, because we're selfish librarians and we like sharing what we like, here's some of our favorite podcasts if you need anything to like kind of start your list of inspirational podcasts that maybe you want.
There you go. Okay, we've got you back now. Hi.
That was so strange.
I think we just dropped your connection there for a second. Welcome back. We're happy to have you. If you'll go ahead and repeat what you just said.
Yep.
In there, because I think we lost you.
And also, let me go ahead and quickly share my screen again. That was so eerie.
And thank you to our folks in the chat who let me know they could hear me, but not you. So
that's fabulous. Yeah.
And this is the best part too. Of course, for us, we're a little biased.
Yeah.
And then we get to recommend things.
We just wanted to share some of our favorite podcasts.
Something we do on a regular basis, recommending things.
Absolutely. And I will mention one that I didn't put on here that is Speak to Scale, and I'll put that in the chat because I did recognize some of the names tonight as people who do have some local businesses, and I think checking out this person might be pretty valuable to you. But let's go on, and okay.
I'll go ahead and start with some of mine while you put that in the chat if you want.
Of course.
If that works. Okay. So as I mentioned just a little bit before, Wait, Don't Tell Me, which is NPR's news quiz show. It's fun. It's nice to be able to also quiz myself on whether or not I'm up to date on the latest in the news. I also enjoy Travel with Rick Steves. It's also, his is interesting because it's both a radio show, but then of course done in podcast format too. So you can just download it at any time. And he's often interviewing folks that work with him as guides in different countries, but also he then interviews other travel industry folks. So when Madeleine was talking about, getting people to come onto your show or interviewing other people that are in your industry or your field, one of the things I listened to was basically said, people are usually very flattered to be invited to give their opinions or share their expertise. So there's nothing wrong with saying I have a unique podcast, but my unique place is also going to be where I can interview other people that are also involved in the industry that I work in, and get their opinions and have them share information. And then, you have that, like Madeleine was saying, that mutual, and maybe that mutual, greatness that you have for each other and appreciation for others in your industry. And then maybe they'll invite you on to their podcast or to do something with them in the future. Ologies, I really like. They have a for kids version and a not for kids version of that show. So she does edit, speaking of having an editor, she does edit some of it down for kids and younger ages too. But it's just a very interesting podcast that a friend told me about. Again, so word of mouth is a good way to get to know folks and what's out there. And I've just become a huge fan of it because basically she's interviewing different people about what they do for their professions, and they're experts in different ologies. So it might be oceanography, like Madeleine had mentioned earlier, or I think recently she had someone on who was an expert on raccoons and raccoon behavior. And it was just fascinating to listen to. So those are some of my favorites. Hit Parade's another one. That's a Slate specific podcast that my spouse and I listen to whenever we're having to drive and do trips, because it is a longer podcast. Usually the episodes are 30 to 60 minutes. But whenever we're on a road trip, it's really fun because it's all about music, and they're kind of a music aficionado. And so they love to guess what's there and guess if they're going to be right about the songs and who's singing and all that kind of stuff. And it's just a kind of a nice history of music. So, okay. And then I'll let you, now that you've got some stuff in the chat.
Yep, I am just answering some questions here. One of the attendees shared the link to the podcast that I mentioned was really great for businesses who maybe want to increase their community. It's essentially just scaling your business with public speaking. And the cool thing was Jessica Rasdahl actually did make a webinar with us all about how to utilize public speaking for your business. So I will go ahead and share that link within the email when we send that out. But a lot of the podcasts that I listed here, they're narrative, nonfiction. Also, I love spooky stories and anything regarding Dolly Parton. So yeah, those were my favorites. But just wanted to let you guys know, because I know we're winding down. We have some really awesome events coming up at the library in our technology and business fields. So the one I have this Thursday with this Champaign Center partnership is leveraging events in Champaign Center. So if you know anyone or even yourselves, business owners who might want to get involved with any of our large, amazing local events, feel free to come into the library. We'll also be airing this on Zoom. And then Susan has some awesome webinars as well.
We got a couple coming up. If you know anyone who's interested in learning a little bit more about Google Docs, Sheets, and Slides, that will be virtual on April 5th. And then we're returning to our in-person workshops. And we'll have getting to know iPhones and iPads and Android phones. And then my favorite workshop to teach, where we will spend some time learning how to take photos with our smartphones or tablets. I bring in some stuffed animal models who are very forgiving while we take pictures of them for that one. So it's a good chance to get more familiar with your apps that you already have on your phone that are your camera apps and what they can do, and then also some additional apps that we'll talk about too. And then for those of you interested in virtual reality, this is our first virtual reality. We got our virtual reality kits right before the pandemic started. So this is the first time we're actually able to debut it to the public. And we will have Eric Johnson, who is the director of Starkville Planetarium and a professor of astronomy, coming to speak to us about some interesting, cool things. We'll take a trip to Mars. We'll talk about the Milky Way. And the nice thing about this is we'll have our VR goggles where we can actually see and basically experience things there in real time with him telling us about it. And then the other one is we have a Getting Started with Coding workshop. For those of you who might have interest in Python, the university's Eta Kappa Nu Honor Society is going to come and present, and everyone will get to learn how to do a little bit of coding in Python.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And we've said this earlier, but there are so many resources and webinars. I mean, we've been doing this for 2 years, available on demand on our YouTube channel, and that's champaign.org/YouTube. I encourage you to just browse around. We have all of our Crafty Adults webinars on there, lots of business webinars, career, and technology, and much more.
Writer's workshop stuff too. So if you're interested in working on improving your writing skills, that's up there too. And all of the things like books for babies and things like story times and stuff too. So yes.
But lastly, we have lots of ways you can hear and learn about our events that we have. You can go to champaign.org/events to check out our event calendar, and that's where you'll find like the how you can sign up to get a headshot from Anna Longworth at the library. And Susan put that in the chat, but would you mind sharing that with everyone? I think we're on the host and panel.
Sorry, yes, now. I did just sorry. That is
I do that all the time. No worries.
That's because I was about to let you know that we couldn't hear you. So I was going to send it just to you to be like, we can't hear you. Here you go, everybody.
I'm glad you can hear me now.
Yes. Yes, me too.
Yeah. But I also want to encourage you. I mean, one of the best things about working at Champaign Public Library is that I get to work with Susan and my other amazing colleagues, and it's been such a joy to do a technology and business webinar this evening. So please don't limit yourself to just one type of program if that's what you've done previously. I always encourage people to just explore what's available and maybe take something you didn't think that you might be interested in.
Yeah. I have attended a lot of our Crafty Adults programs as a non-crafter who now feels like she has a little bit of craftiness to her. So I do encourage you to watch those videos too. It's been a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. Well, there's some amazing colleagues that do those too. And this slide is for signing up. Specifically, we have a monthly message that we each send out for business and career in tech, where you can sign up. And then usually we publish that before the main library newsletter comes out. So if you want first dibs on places of, if any of the events require registration or anything like that, this is a good way to find out first about things that are coming up.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. So winding down, thank you all for coming to tonight's webinar. If you want to schedule a one-on-one with either Susan or myself or any of our other incredibly qualified librarians and staff, feel free to go to our website at champaign.org/book-a-librarian. We can dive deeper into the one-page marketing plan, or Susan can help you work on your diction for recording a podcast. And you can always ask us questions during our open hours in the live chat you can find on our website, or message us at your leisure to and send us an email at librarian@champaign.org.
Yeah, we're here to help.
Connect with us. We're always excited to help. I mean, it's kind of our chosen career path, and we do love it.
We do.
We
love answering questions.
Yes. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Again, just as a reminder, this whole session was recorded and we will be sending it out to everyone along with the resources mentioned in chat and also just within the presentation itself. So thank you. I don't think we've had any additional questions, Susan. All right. Well, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.